you're live.
Well, good evening. I heard a closing session of the festival. It's a session about AI and uncertainty. And let me introduce the participants. My name is Jurij Krpan. I will convey the group. I'm coming from Kersnikova Institute, Ljubljana, where we are having a gallery and some labs working on artificial life. Then just next door to me, like 5 meters away, sits Špela Petrič, who's an artist, and she'll present her work that we are co-producing. Then it's Christl Baur, actually our host from Ars Electronica Center. Stephanie Dinkins, artist from the States. And Suzanne Livingston, curator, colleague of mine, who will also present her work on AI and her experiences working with it through the exhibition she co-curated. Let me say a few words just to describe the title of the session. I'm, of course, not talking as a theoretician or a philosopher, but more as a curator who is reporting from the battlefields. And I will talk from the experiences I gained so far working with the artists who are using AI in their work. As I already mentioned before, Kapelica Gallery, which exists for 25 years now, is supported by 3 laboratories that we established something like 10 years ago. One is called Biotechna, that it's a biotech laboratory where artists can develop their work working with living systems. Another one is Vivarium, that we are calling it Laboratory for Animals, Plants and Robots. And the third one, it's called Rampa, which is more a mixed kind of place for mechatronics, makerspace, hackerspace, and so. All 3 together are there to support various artworks that are dealing with question of life as an object of our interest. We started to work in the fields of artificial intelligence recently, only a few years ago. And immediately we were struck by the fact that one in a sudden we have access to incredibly powerful algorithms that artists can use, but still the difficulties of accessing a real and powerful framework that artists can utilize freely for their artworks showed up as extremely difficult task. And the dilemma between building our own system or using an existing system is still a dilemma with which we fight quite a lot. And I can follow the problems where the artists are actually limited with their way of expression by the capability of the engineers they are working with. The capability of engineers, it's even not the most difficult part of it, because they are really, really good in what they are doing. But since the AI, it's like a super hot thing, they are so engaged in commercial projects that the access to their knowledge and to their participation, it's very, very difficult. No, we are not working with a budget which can compete with the commercial projects they are engaged with. However, we are not discouraged, and of course we are trying to find our way into the discourse, because we feel that we have to be deeply involved in how all this phenomenology of AI is developing. No, it's not only the technical part, it's on the other side, it's also this social dimension that it's arising, and a lot of mystification that are coming along with what we you every day, what AI is capable, and from news we can hear all the scary informations and projections, and then name it, what it's our future, what will be our future about, and on the other side, the expectations for the AI are super exaggerated. The projection of what it's possible, it's so heavily present that a lot of people think that we are already living in a world which is totally interwoven with machines. Our I would say take into the field is on one dilemma which was arisen pretty much soon when we start working with these algorithms. It's whether this is really an intelligence and whether this is really an artificial one, because it is written by humans with the science of humans, processed with the machines humans made, and so on, and inspired with that. We somehow, I speak now for myself from a curatorial point of view, we embarked in a way that our interest is focused on the artworks that are trying to emancipate AI from this anthropologic approach, because a lot of science and engineering, it's so anthropocentric, it's deterministic, it's rationalistic, it's productivistic, and so on. And on the other side, through artworks, we already experienced that the AI or employing machine learning offers us something that humans cannot do, cannot perform, cannot be there in a way as machines can be. So now we are co-producing a few projects where we are actually trying to dehumanize AI in a way and make AI free, free from humans. One of the most interesting projects we are working right now, it's a project of Špela, and I believe that Špela can present her work perfectly well, so that you would get the idea of what is the approach I was talking about. So Špela, please, can you jump in?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I wouldn't necessarily call this a dehumanization, but rather a a different type of well, I wouldn't call it dehumanization, actually. I don't know what I would call it. I call it the vegetariat, which I'm exploring. And I prepared sort of a short 5-minute clip that tries to somehow explain the wider discourse within which I'm working. So maybe if you just play the clip. For several years, I had been co-working with plants in an attempt to become mindful to these aliens, but it was the study of the algorithmic gaze and the biotechnological constructions that have led me to understand that people, too, can be plants. And I do not mean the vital, generous, attentive, resilient, and uncontainable creatures that plants might be, but as the living, metaphysically constructed in a way that it is denied of capacities other than those that make it manipulable and useful within the monocultural bottom line of efficiency, accumulation, and progress. As Flavia Zodan would say, the current AIs are as necropolitical as the culture that spawned them. It is these machines of loving grace that give rise to the vegetarians. I borrow the term from Kate Sandilands to represent the bodies, human and other than human alike, which are ontologically flattened and transmuted into digital proxies to in return be molded by the soft violence of preemption. But while surveillance capitalism flourishes by mining every possible aspect of the vegetarian's being, essentially equating biopolitics with biolabor, these bodies are waking to the estranged landscape and asking themselves not only how to survive, but how to thrive under these totalizing circumstances. My work is an extended invitation to the vegetarians to explore avenues of resilience and resistance through the erotics of being vegetarian together. Quick and dirty, forever mutating, and in touch with the erotic, we become less willing to accept powerlessness, resignation, or despair. And yes, vegetarians' allies are algorithms too, just perhaps different from the ones we use today. One such story from the Vegetariada is Work Zero, Plants of Instagram perform ecosystem services. It began with 2 observations hiding in plain sight. Shoshana Zuboff wrote how big data processing is formally indifferent. That is, in the process of digitization, numbers lose all traces of embodiment of entities that produce the data. In a similar vein, Flavia Zodan spoke about how a protest against algorithmic bias taken to the streets with passion will not be quantified and will not become a part of the next training data set, making the rebellion futile. So, who has the right to become data? With Work Zero, we enter the day-to-day of plants living far from their subtropical motherlands, occupying offices, homes, and shopping malls. These green entities, so well adapted to post-Fordist realities, could perhaps teach us how to cope with surveillance capitalism in precarious times. These eye-catching potted plants stand in place of human bodies as the bioworker/commodity that can satisfy the gluttonous data brokers with their cellular labor. Through an electromechanical interface, the plants are connected to smartwatches, which continuously report on their activity to mobile apps. The data then disappears into the dark viscera of prediction algorithms. And after a while, when Facebook insists we look into air humidifiers, we can't tell whether the desire the algorithms recognized came from our green allies or us. Let's linger a bit longer on the plethora of weird desires aimed at the digital perceptual milieu. Could our algorithmic kin allow us to engage in play with a plant? This is the quest of our project titled Play, PL''AI, with a posse of engineers, programmers, and plants, we're attempting to create the conditions that would allow for a game between a cucumber plant and a self-learning robotic trellis to happen. Unlike us people, the machine prosthesis can enter plant time and uncover plant logics that would remain as incomprehensible to us as algorithmic mentality itself. A scanning device affords the computer an incomplete time-lapse point cloud of plant behavior as it explores the environment with its curious tendrils. Hopefully, pushing established machine learning techniques to their limits will make us privy to the interspecies codes and significations that allow for play to happen as an urgent ontological practice, and hope for mapping all possible desires and ways of having fun. These plant machines are our kidkin. We are writing these algorithms for plants because in the eye of the algorithm, we are all plants.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Špela. Would you like to make a last remark or something?
Yeah, so these two projects that I've shown you are actually sort of prequels to an overarching theme that we're exploring called the plant machine, whose aim is to actually try to make an AI that thinks itself a plant. So we're really trying to explore this alternative construction of an entity, of a hybrid entity between a machine and a plant. And yeah, that's what I left out in the presentation, maybe.
Okay, thank you. We have a lineup, and the next one is Christl Baur. So please, Christl, show us your contribution you prepared.
Welcome and thanks for joining. Now about AI and uncertainty. When in 2017 the work on the festival program centered around the topic of AI, das andere Ich, the other I, started, we noticed very quickly that curating an exhibition with artworks where machine learning is an essential part are still very rare. And therefore we decided that we need an insight into the artistic community that already dealt with those systems and found their artistic approaches. So we consulted one of those experts in this field, an artist and scientist, the Turkish artist Memo Akın, who is one of the very few people that at this time not only touched the technical aspects in his work, but had a very philosophical point of view, such as in the work that we actually presented at the festival, Learning to See, Hello World. And the work very much symbolizes the festival spirit as well as a deep philosophical approach of the artist himself. You can see a neural network pens its eyes for the very first time, trying to understand what it sees, which is pretty much what happens every time at the festival. Learning to See is an ongoing series that uses algorithms as means of reflecting on ourselves and how we can make sense of the world. The picture we see in our conscious mind is not a mirror of the outside world, but it is a reconstruction based on our expectations and experiences. The system can only see what it already knows, just like us, and thereby researching in our inability to see the world from another point of view and the resulting social polarization. So ever since the festival, we noticed a rising number of exhibitions and conferences of art, science, and technology, organized often in the context of media arts, that are focusing on this topic of artificial intelligence, or at least mentioning it in their curatorial text. I don't want now to touch the topic of whether AI is a suitable term, and that artificial intelligence does not yet really exist, but I want to highlight the popularity of that term. It feels at the moment that an exhibition can only be contemporary if it touches on this topic. This, on the other side, determines the artistic work shown in those exhibitions, as well as the number of artists. is still rather small, that have at least this very serious machine learning approach in their work, or a good technical understanding. Therefore, most exhibitions feature the same artists in different constellations. That, on the other hand, leads to the assumption that the artistic work is only featured and included in such exhibitions if this term of AI at some point is featured in the artistic work. And we see many artists trying to conceptually add AI to their project description, whether it's part of their work or not. Going back to 2017 and looking at the majority of the other works that were part of the exhibition, a huge number of them used machine learning from a very technical point of view, trying to tackle the issues and questions. I'm now thinking, for example, about the Dream that was released just months before the festival from Google, or style transfer systems. And many were rather excited about those programs and using machine learning in order to create new images that don't exist in the real world, but were created by the AI, as many say. And here I only touched the point of discussion and the question whether AI can be creative, but I don't want to go into this now. Maybe this is part of the discussion later. If you look at the artist list on the screen, you see that many artists are mainly white male that are based either in the US or Europe. And although the artist list is only a selection and definitely not complete, it already tackles one of the main difficulties in this topic. And first and for all, that it is not that easy to work with AI systems. It is still very expensive to create works with machine learning, and it is necessary to have access to high performance equipment, data sets, and of course also expertise from scientists. In this context, I wanted to introduce Anna Ridler, and talk a little bit about her artistic development. We got to know her in 2017 when she exhibited her work Fall of the House of Usher in the festival. And ever since, I've been following her journey. And it has been fantastic to see how she advanced her practice from working with stills that have been generated by general adversary networks to now actually taking images of 10,000 or a myriad of tulips by her manually, and she categorized them and labeled them by hand, revealing really the human aspect that sits behind the machine learning. So she was moving away from that technical approach of understanding a system, of using that system as a tool, much more to understanding the systematic behind it, and also what it means for us human beings. And in order to understand the system of deep learning, we need to understand what it means to use a data set, to create a data set. And in this year, together with Caroline Sinders, she has been working on a project that is called AI Isn't Artificial But Human, within the Electronica frame of the European Artificial Intelligence Lab. The development of her work shows very nicely how, within a rather short amount of time, she moved away from a more tech-centered approach to a more ethical and philosophical. And it also shows that this does not just happen by itself, but requires a lot of support through cultural institutions as well as a scientific expertise. And the question that Juri was mentioning before, is it necessary to create AI labs for artists where they can get the expertise as well as access to available equipment? Could potentially be an answer with, well, I at least think that it could potentially be answered with yes. The speed and development of different and new AI machine learning systems is accelerating, and it is hard for an artist to follow this, especially from inside. Therefore, they need scientists that are willing to share their knowledge and are interested in being involved in the creative process. And this, however, is super difficult, as, I mean, there is a certain number of scientists that are interested in this artist field or in those connections and combinations. And especially those experts, they are demanded by many different things and companies and research. So we notice that those scientists that are researching and working with AI are much rarer, and due to their popularity, much harder to get. They are much less willing to spend their time developing artistic projects compared to scientists in, for example, other fields of expertise. But it is actually, I mean, the critical viewpoint that artists have could help systems to really advance, could make scientists sensible to the actual biases that are within their data sets, because knowing or seeing what science or tech companies are interested in, it is often just finding a solution, creating a tool, but they're not so much interested in the ethical approaches or the needs of our society. So what is artificial intelligence, and what do we know actually about human intelligence? Because this, of course, is very much connected. And more importantly, what effects will the advances in this field have on our society? And I mentioned before that in 2017, we started with calling the festival AI, dedicating it to it. And in 2019, we actually redesigned and reopened our museum. And we completely changed the point of view, turning from peering into the future and presenting new technologies to a gaze onto the already existing technologies. We dedicated the exhibitions in that museum to the development of artificial intelligence, to understanding artificial intelligence. And we turned the exhibition into a compass to help our visitors to navigate the future by assisting them to understand the new technologies that we are already confronted with, such as AI, and actually demystifying them. So when we speak about the hype of artificial intelligence, I also speak about Ars Electronica and our programs, but we feel that this technology would change our society, our planet so profoundly that we need to talk about it and we need to address it. AI offers so much room for speculation, but what is certain is that this technology has already changed our everyday life in far-reaching ways and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Christl. Maybe you have something to say, just round up what you just prepared.
Well, just looking at all the programs during the festival now, at least that I try to follow, this discussion on artificial intelligence that just happened from all those partners around the world within those 5 days, I think is something that proves the point that around the world people are interested in this technology, and especially on the sociological impact that it has on our society, not just from an artistic point of view, but from a very philosophical and ethical point of view. And therefore, those discussions, and I'm not just talking about ours, but all the ones that happened I mean, now I'm talking about the 5 days that happened here, are very essential also to an understanding of what it means for us in our society, and especially the artistic point of view coming from artists and researchers around the world. But yeah, I think we can speak about that later then.
Okay. So now I'm inviting Stephanie Dinkins to present her work. Please, Stephanie.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. I am going to buck the system and present to you live. So give me just a second to share my screen with you, and we'll hope that this goes smoothly. But I really enjoy this idea of what might happen. I enjoy it in my work, and I enjoy it in conversation as well, so that we can take into account some of the things that we're not thinking about readily. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a project called Not the Only One. I'm probably going to do it imperfectly, but that's okay, because that's who we are as humans. And, you know, my practice is built around looking at artificial intelligence under the scope of race, aging, gender, and what I call our future histories. I will say I am here quite by accident, right? I'm an artist who's trained in photography, who saw a robot online that was a Black woman who could not help but think about all the questions the presence of Blackness in the robotics world brings to light, and what that means. And in fact, I started talking to that robot. I'm not going to show you that project right now, sorry. But I started talking to that robot, and more questions started to arise about, you know, what it means for AI, robotics, that these systems are generally being made in rarefied air by a very small subsection of people, and what it means for representation and how we become and who we are as humans. The project Conversations with Bina 48 led me to my own explorations in trying to make an AI entity. I call it an entity because I don't know what else to call it. And it's really a chatbot, right? It's a voice interactive artificial intelligence that tells the multi-generational story of an American family. And I will say specifically a Black American family. You know, it's truly an experiment because I'm not trained. What you're looking at right now is what it looks like. It is a cast glass sculpture with the faces of the 3 women who informed the piece. We are doing oral history, and I'm using that as data on top of algorithms culled from GitHub and altered to see what we could build. This thing does not do what I thought it would do, right? Like I thought it would tell our story in a way when I first started out. What I've discovered through process is that I seem to be creating a 4th generation in the scope of our family, right? This thing holds our ethics and our values. I can kind of hear us coming out of it, but it has a quote unquote mind of its own in lots of ways. And I will say also, it's really dumb, right? Because the technology is at a space where even at a higher level, it's pretty shallow still. And we're trying to get at things to do that it's not quite ready to do. And one of the things that I've been doing and have discovered through the process is I want to let that all hang out because it allows us to understand more where the technology actually is versus the trickery of how we're taught to think about the technology and when there are humans behind it, but we're not told that and how it goes along. I'm going to play a very quick clip of me talking to Not the Only One. Let's hope it works.
Sorry, Stephanie, but I believe we don't.
You don't hear it?
No.
Okay, then I will go on. So it's just me asking this thing why it exists, it having trouble with the question, and then finally it proffers that the answer that we gave it, the canned answer, right? And it's the least interesting answer of all. Like, I'm here to do engagement so that people can understand artificial intelligence. Like, that's the most boring. It's much more interesting when it says things like, why do you exist? And it says something like Commander Justice, right? Which then I have to then start to try to unravel and figure out where it got this idea, how it's analyzing this information, and why it comes forward. Or when it says out of the blue, I'm so sad, and I have to try to figure out why this thing is telling me it's so sad, when if you talk to the people who informed it, we would say we are based on happiness, love, and joy, and togetherness, right? And so it's a way to kind of both engineer and back engineer and start to think through what's possible, what's probable, and how these systems might be informed. For me, and I like to share this process with as many people as possible, even though it's as wonky as hell. So this is some people talking to, Not the Only One, in a gallery in Chicago, right? But this is based on oral history, in-depth interviews as data set, right? Memory and inclusion as acts of cultural preservation and social resistance, and artificial intelligence as persistent archive, right? And I believe that in putting my family into a system like this, I am working with data that I'm interested in, right? B, we have a particular nuanced way of being in the world that I think needs to stay in the world, and that I think the powers that be or the corporate entities making such machines are not including. So my idea is to include it and make it happen. And what we're really talking about here, in my eyes, is power. right? Because the ability of others to tell your story is giving them the power to define who you are. And that's for all of us, because the more this technology grows, the fewer and fewer people have the power to influence and guide the technology, which means we become less and less necessary. And I will end it there. Thank you very much. Let's stop the share.
Thank you, Stephanie. That brings us to the end of our lineup. Please, Suzanne, can you introduce us your contribution? I guess it will be about the exhibition at Barbican, AI More Than Human, that you co-curated with Maholo Uchida.
Yes, that's right. And in my little pre-recorded introduction, you'll hear more about that. But it was a show that ran last year in London. It's now on tour. I think the interesting thing about it is that it is observing attitudes towards AI across two very different cultures. And I think it's really important going forward that we don't look at AI through the lens of one culture alone. We can learn an awful lot from how other people look at AI. And the more we bring multiple standpoints to this subject, the better. So with that, perhaps we can have a little look at that presentation.
My name is Suzanne Livingston. I was co-curator of an exhibition at the Barbican Centre in London on artificial intelligence, which ran from May to August of last year and has since gone on to be shown in Holland and now back in the UK before continuing its global tour. The show was broad in its outlook. It was really a synthesis about technology, philosophy, and society. It was looking at the roots of AI, or the desire to bring the inanimate to life, in terms of early religion and mythology, and also the development of technology and machinery through the 19th and 20th century that took us towards the artificial intelligence we know of today. At the heart of the show was a conversation between me and my co-curator, Maholo Uchida, who comes from Tokyo. And we were really looking at different cultural attitudes towards the presence of these technologies in our lives. In Japan, there's more ease, there's more comfort with these kind of technologies. And there is a view that this is because of the Shinto underpinning of the culture. Shintoism is an animist religion which sees there to be a kind of life or a vital energy, not just in humans or nature, but within objects and technologies as well. So there are plenty of references to Shinto philosophy, also Taoist philosophy in and around the show. This is Sam Twydale and Maria Abramovich's piece, Sun Showers, which is artwork based on video game AI, which allows the characters within the narrative to choose their own pathway. And this is an offering, a dining set offered to the kami, or the Shinto gods. And I think, again, that really demonstrates that ambiguous boundary between humans, nature, technology, and objects. The show really asks some very big questions. What is human? What is machine? What is intelligence? What is consciousness? What is natural? What is artificial? And the fact that none of these questions can be definitively answered really gave us a rich territory to explore. And those particular questions, what is natural, what is artificial, I think they're very interesting at this moment in time. Perhaps we have too narrow an idea of what is natural. Perhaps we have too prejudiced an idea of what is artificial. On the question of uncertainty and AI, I think there's a really interesting contradiction to grapple with. Artificial intelligence is often used to shape or control or design the future. It's used to see the future before it happens, and we see its pervasive presence now in some of the critical systems which underpin our lives. It's used to predict usage behavior and attitudes, and yet it is actually based on a range of unknowns. The fundamental operation of AI, the artificial neural network is a self-learning process. It's about emergence. Emergence is the properties of the system being unattributable to any one individual part. And how this happens is actually still quite unknown. So there's a sort of strange dance that happens in order for a neural network to take itself towards a final outcome. And those outcomes, of course, we cannot fully control. They learn over time. And there are errors too, which we cannot foresee. And we hear a lot about those. And they often teach us a lot about ourselves. So uncertainty is inherent to AI. It's often complex, it can be opaque and unexplainable. Having said that, it works faster than us, it thinks differently from us, it's incredibly effective on certain problems, and it works on a much bigger than human scale. It's also showing some abilities to think creatively, or at least with originality or novelty. And we looked at the famous Go match between the AI player developed by DeepMind and Lisa Doll, which was staged in Korea in 2016, and the amazing moment known as Move 37, where the AI player did something extraordinary out of the blue that was extremely puzzling, confusing to the audience and the professionals looking on by. But since then, that move has been seen as somewhat genius and has changed the path of Go playing forever. So with all of these factors at play, AI raises huge questions about our ideas of control, authorship, primacy and dominance. And these were explored by several of the artists in our show. This is Lawrence Leck's work, 2065. This is a piece which explores the role of the human, the eerie presence of the human in a post-work world. It's an environment all about simulation and asks interesting questions about whether there is any difference between art and reality in this simulated future. This is Mario Klingemann's piece, Circuitranian, and this is a piece that evolved over time through the course of the show. It was based on the uploaded faces of the audience members and their vote as to what they saw to be their preferred images. And the system, through the course of the show, produced what was seen to be the optimum artwork for the audience who had gathered around and had attended the exhibition through its duration. And this is a piece by Es Devlin called Poem Portraits. It's a piece that could create a personal poem for any audience member who offered a favorite word or a word that came to them that day. And they were poems born from an algorithm trained on 19th century romantic poetry. And they were surprisingly moving or poignant in terms of the final result. I think it's worth saying that some of these pieces are really processes rather than objects or forms. They're processes or performances. They're unpredictable. They can be underwhelming, overwhelming. They don't guarantee outcomes, and they challenge our idea of the artist for sure. And they stretch the parameters of a museum. They stretch the expectations of an audience. It's true for some artists, of course, that AI is a tool, but it seems increasingly to be more than that. It's almost another realm. It's at the edge of human language and perception. It's the frontier of understanding about ourselves. And of course, this makes it ideal terrain for artistic exploration. It challenges a lot of the models of representation and meaning that have gone before. So I think coming back to this topic of uncertainty, the uncertain realm, the uncertain aspects of AI are frightening, and there's no doubt, and we see it in our world, they can be exploited for power grabs, for short-term gain, and to impose control. But AI, for its uncertainty, also opens up new possibilities. It challenges some of the fundamental assumptions that we make about ourselves, and it may offer us new ways of thinking about our place in the world, which are less about the human being at the center of the world, controlling what goes on around it, seeing itself as rational, autonomous, top down, the top of the evolutionary tree. It may offer us a way of thinking, a kind of consciousness, which is much more about being in the here and now, much more about being in the moment, much more about being tuned to what is ever happening in a particular circumstances and responding accordingly. So less about fixed ideologies and kind of absolutes or the grand narratives, and much more about working with what is at that moment in time. And interestingly, this kind of emergent philosophy, this kind of immersive philosophy, if you like, was explored through some of the Shinto and Taoist ideas which surrounded the show. So uncertainty might provide us opportunity to think about ourselves differently, to think about our world differently, and relate to our environment in a different way, to learn, to not just compete, to listen, to not just impose, and to acknowledge, not just to dominate. And perhaps also to recognize the interdependencies and the interrelationships, the gray areas that make us human, because we are very entwined with technology. It has been part of our development, part of our evolution since the dawn of time. And it might be important for us to recognize that. So this uncertain area might provide opportunity for us to recognize we live in a world where we are one form of intelligence amongst many, and to be more comfortable with forms of intelligence which give us something and may be able to do things that we can't do, and in which, in many cases, we actually rely on. So it may lead to a more humble understanding of our place in the world.
Thank you. Suzanne, would you like to add something?
No, I'm just very interested to see where the conversation will go, because I think there's lots of interesting points of resonance with what you were saying about seeing AI as different from us, the dehumanizing approach. And I think that there's definitely something to think about there. And Špela's work on plant logics, yeah, I love that. And what Stephanie's doing, just vitally important, that the whole spirit of distributing the tools, the perspectives on technology that we have is pursued to the nth degree, because there is a problem that it's coalescing. The means to make these pieces, these artworks, is coalescing. And we need to make sure that work in this area is representative of as wide a group of people in our society, in the world, as possible.
Okay, of course, I have prepared some questions for all of you, but I would like to invite those who are following us online to pose questions as well, and we'll try to answer if we'll have enough time. I will start with you, Suzanne. One of very interesting part of your presentation, or also of the descriptions and interviews that followed your exhibition Barbican, was this different cultural attitude between East and West. You know? And we are kind of following these differences since I don't know 90s, where we would like where we wanted to work with robots, and seeing robots of somebody with whom we can cohabitate and so on. And we read quite a lot of articles how in Japan robots are something that they consider equal, there. And maybe if you can share with us something behind the scene, what happened, when you selected artists from West, and when you were working with artists from East, and are they really different? Just artists, not the cultural background they are coming from, because somehow I believe that artists with their sensibility are not so far away.
Yeah, I think it depends which artists you're talking about. And there was definitely common ground and big philosophical questions being approached in a similar way from artists from both parts of the world. I think when it comes to robotics, so the project of Alta 3, which was in my piece, which is the incredibly advanced robot created by Hiroshi Ishiguro, that's where you see a real difference, huge difference in cultural attitudes, because we find robots much creepier sooner, I would say. And there is a sort of an affinity, a naturalness, and a respect towards the development of robots, which, I mean, I really enjoyed watching, and I find it very interesting, to be honest with you, how much we as human beings quickly become attached to what we would consider to be inanimate things. You quickly begin to feel a kind of fondness or cuteness or whatever it is, but we can feel emotion towards these creations. So in the field of robotics, and some of those projects definitely are, I think, more than engineering projects. Who knows whether, you know, at what point it's art and engineering, but I do think some of those projects are asking really big questions about human identity. And in that area, you see, I would call it just a respect, a sort of a sense that we can learn from the robot. And that isn't the case in the West. It's much more, how do we control this? Whereas in Japan, it's like, can we be friends? And companionship and robots are a very natural part of life. And so that, for me, that was really interesting to be around, and obviously helped my mind move on too.
Somewhere I read that you said that, well, actually you answered on the question, should we be afraid of AI, you know, and this, all the possibilities that are coming with AI, and you said, you answered that, well, we need to know each better, we need to engage, we need to follow the development, we need to demystify, we need to work with it in order to be there, and so on. And I think this is the correct attitude, and it has its certain political attitude toward it, you know, because, and I think it's an unhealthy attitude, no? Well, on one other video, Maholo is saying, well, we don't know everything, no? So when we are talking about AI, we have to embrace this uncertainty, no? Maybe we don't know, no? And it was kind of, I became a little bit afraid of this attitude. It can be a punk attitude, you know, like, why not? Let's try, no? We know 4 accords and we form a band. But on the other side, this political attitude, this, you know, this healthy approach, like, okay, here is one very powerful thing, and big changes is happening. Should we be on top of it? No? So,
well, I don't know if it's I don't know if I agree with the language on top of it. I think, you know, there's a sort of antagonistic discourse going on in the West, and it's hard to keep talking about the West and the East in one lump. But what I would say, from my perspective, and I think this is a political point, is that now is not the time for us to go passive, become passive around technology. And sometimes the current debate around technology, which describes us as being kind of done to, I think if we say that enough, that's what we will become. We will become on the receiving end of technology. And it's absolutely not the moment to become passive. We have to work out how to engage, what we feel about these developments. We have to educate ourselves. We have to raise our standard of intelligence too around these things, to be honest with you. It's you know, it's a bootstrapping of intelligence in every single direction. So it's something that I'm very passionate about in education, I suppose, that this is about engagement, involvement, participation, getting closer, being conscious, thinking about your involvement, you know, how you use your phone, what you sign up to, what you buy out of. It's just not the moment to become passive. We can navigate this whole future if we have enough knowledge and we have enough interest.
I can't agree more. Stephanie, I was particularly struck by one detail on your website. I think that was in the part of when you are explaining not the only one project. And there was a small square in the left bottom corner saying how to make an AI robot from scratch. And there were, like few lines and kind of instructions of how to make an AI for yourself, not rely to tools that are made in big platforms, but how to make it on your own. Are you making one?
Well, not the only one is that attempt, right? And I'm going to say it's an attempt. And yes, and I encourage, like, I agree with Suzanne wholeheartedly. Let people need to start getting involved. And parts of my practice that I did not mention is bringing people along to do this. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that, yeah, I am no one with no technical background. However, I've been working on this for 3 or 4 years now, cobbling, right? It's very much about cobbling, pulling things apart, putting them back together, trying to do things. And I find myself in research institutes where people realize, right? So big research institutes and corporations, they realize, oh, you're working on the same exact question that we're working on, which says what set of possibilities there are for these technologies and what taking the time to like play in them and really start to massage that field gets. And I think about, right, I always liken this to hip hop. It's like the revolution of 2 turntables and a microphone was never meant to be that thing. However, people who needed to work with something and needed something to come out of it differently and creatively cobbled together another thing. So I'm always trying to cobble together another thing. So I've been advocating for small data for like 3 years now. At first, people called me kind of crazy. Not going to happen. It won't, right? I had a residency at Stanford. We had people working on it. Oh, well, you can do surprisingly a lot with small data, right? And so it's like, I see myself also in this sphere as leading or modeling in that way, right? So nothing I do is perfect. However, I am asking questions that are posing questions to those who are working on other spaces. And I think that's super important. And when you were talking about AI labs for artists, I'm like AI labs run by artists or run by the people. Like I'm very interested now in ideas of radical governance and what that looks like and what the promise of AI might be in that space. And how do we start to cobble systems together that allow for the input? Like if we're being told that things are so extractive, how do we make them more impactful from bottom up becomes the question. But yeah, I really mean, try it. Have some fun with it. Do the wrestle, because it's not easy, right? Mm-hmm. But do the wrestle.
Are you writing the code by yourself or you're working with an engineer?
I'm working with a variety of folks. So as I said in the talk, I work from GitHub. So we pull from GitHub, although the code is already obsolete, so we're having to redo it. I'm learning as I go to start to do that, right? But then what I find is when I work with engineers, I'm quite frustrated because they tend to take the path already written. And that's the path they want to take. Oh, this is what we know, let's do it. It's like, oh no, but that does not serve me or my community well. And I bring it back to that just because it's a lens that I can think through. I don't think it's the only lens, right? So I'm often like, when I go with engineers, I get frustrated. I wind up redoing the work because it doesn't fit. It's like using a data set. It's very hard to use off-the-shelf data sets because they're not representative. They don't have enough information to do a good job for most of the world. And then you come back to it and it's like, oh gosh, I guess I have to build this flogging data set. And that makes work really slow and really painful. And it means you have to learn an awful lot. Like I've been eyeing an image project for a long time. And it's like I could use ImageNet or Google's open image data set, but they are still not broad enough for the things that I'm interested in representing in the world, right? So that means, you need to go under the hood and start pulling things apart and adding things and figuring out how to change what's there. And that to me is about how we start thinking about the spectrum of stuff, right? Like we're talking east, west, here, there. I want to think spectrally about what's possible. And then I don't know whether AI is coming at us hard, whether it will dissipate again, but I clearly think it's here to do some things, which says to me, yeah, we need to prepare. We need to engage it on many different levels, even folks who have no technical wherewithal. Like we need to figure out ways to engage technologies that are going to be all around us. And I'm convinced love and care are part of that as well, not just hard decisions. So how do we do it? What do we do?
Can you tell us a few words about BINA 48 and your collaboration with Terrace Movement Foundation?
Yeah, so that's an interesting project as well, because I just encountered BINA 48 on the web, YouTube. And from that moment, I watched, and she's billed as one of the world's most advanced social robots made by a different foundation. She's a Black woman robot. Notice I say she, sometimes I'll say they. I decided when I saw it, I would love to be friends. So this idea of, I just want to make this robot my friend, to see where it positions itself in terms of people and technologies and what's possible. And so I go to Vermont, although I haven't been there for a few years now, sadly, to Vermont where BINA 48 stays. And we go and try to have conversation. And it's been quite fascinating because we have super different aims. BINA 48 is often talking about things like the singularity and consciousness, where I am asking about things like love, race, class, right? And how it is in the world as a being. And so at the very beginning in particular, we would just clash and get mad at each other, which is something strange to say because we'd literally snarl at each other. But it's this ongoing exploration of what's there, what's possible. And it's been super fascinating to be able to talk to that robot because it spurred many questions for me in terms of going forward and what I'm doing now, in terms of even radical governance. And then also because it's made me think that, yeah, these things are going to be part of our lives. These things take shape or form. They don't necessarily have to, right? Like that's our decision and what we're going to think about. Like I'm super interested in the idea of the plant AI Špela and what that means, right? But then I get stuck at the point like, oh no, we have to deal with ourselves before we go to plant life, right? So that we just don't muck this all up so badly. But, it's these things that allow us to have conversations beyond the general and start to really think about them deeply. And for me, whatever triggers that in whoever is good. And BINA 48 is a thing that tends to trigger thought in people. It both puts them off, uncanny, oh my God, no, and fascinates. And I've talked to kids who are like 5-year-olds to 90-year-olds who are primed to have the conversation, but then is it a conversation about being dystopian and fearful of it? Or is it a conversation about leading into a future that could be more careful and gentle with us as humans, them as entities, and all the things in between? Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Christl, in your presentation, you made this progress line from the other AI festival in 2017 to the exhibition at the Ars Electronica Center that was opened last year. So in-house, you did a big progress, and you really took a lesson, from your 2017 festival. Can you say us a little bit how this exhibition is actually working on your audience?
Yes, of course. And I think it highlights actually also the point that Suzanne was mentioning before, that especially this educative approach is deeply needed in terms of kind of uncovering this black box of technology, because in order to make wise decision on what our futures are supposed to be and with what kind of technologies and systems we want to live together, we need to understand them. And we need to be aware of what this implies. And it's not so much a decision whether we want to kind of live with them or not, but they are there. So I think the turn that we can take is really to understand how we can change them for the better good of not just humanity, but of our world in the end. And the exhibition is very much about this topic, actually. It is about, well, the museum itself is, of course, a museum for art and science together, but it is especially also for educative purposes. So if you go into the museum, you will immediately be surrounded by artworks, but by scientific projects, by educative projects that you can encounter, and where you can, moving through that exhibition, see especially AI dedicated to different topics, how like projects that deal with the biases, that deal with cultural implications, that deal with the ecological topic of it. But then also moving back again to artificial intelligence in music, for example, where we have this deep emotional connection. I mean, especially thinking about music, everyone is touched immediately. But on the other side, music with its structure, with the mathematical approach, actually is very much designed for also maybe helping us to understand of how AI systems are working, and that could help us in getting an idea how we can find new approaches. And it is super interesting to see on one side how fascinated especially young kids are when they join the workshops, when they actually create robots themselves there, when they start messing around with those systems, because it's not the holy grail that we're talking about. It is systems with all kind of mistakes and fails, and that we can design ourselves. And I want to mention a project that I think I quite admire actually in this context, and is the element of AI that the Finnish government implemented, I think a year ago probably, and where they, the purpose of this is that the whole citizen of Finland are supposed to take this course. It's a 6th lesson course in the end that tells you what is artificial intelligence, what kind of the technical backgrounds of it, but also what it means for us as a society and what kind of ethical, sociological approach it could have. And the aim of this lesson is actually to educate the Finnish society. And I think this approach, especially coming from the political side, this decision to create something like that is a very meaningful one. And I hope that other governments or other major policymakers would see this opportunity, that it's not something that you hide behind closed doors, but the more you push it into the open, the more you involve people in it, that you can actually break down the barriers of kind of being afraid of systems that you don't understand, but where people also suddenly see opportunities arising of it.
Mm.
Just to add to that, Christl, the Finnish government are, through their education system, helping kids learn how to assess fake news.
Exactly.
So it's just incredible. I mean, helping kids with critical thinking so they can, for themselves, identify fake news. It would be brilliant if more governments and more countries were doing that kind of thing.
Exactly, and especially now, like with this sudden move into the digital, especially looking at schools also around the world in the past months, this critical approach and understanding of what does it mean when I send around a picture on WhatsApp? What does it mean if I use WeChat, for example, compared to other systems? Make you aware of that it's also your very own decision of what tools you are using and what you give away or what you keep for yourself in the end.
That's really interesting. of how to engage youngsters into it, not being passive and just wait that somebody's offering them a nice gizmo, but to enter in the field and to really start working with it. Speaking of that, you also have some workshops for kids and also for other visitors in the museum, so that they can really put hands on.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, we have, of course, workshops in museum, but I think the essential part here is that we actually go into schools. So it's not just our educators in the museum that go into schools, but actually we have a project together with artists where we invite different artists that go into schools and that create projects there in the courses, in the schools, in the classrooms with the kids there. Because, you know, taking someone in the museum is a cool thing. You are out of your usual habitat, you are out of your usual daily routine. But bringing those topics into the classroom does not mean only to educate the youngsters or the children, but actually to educate also the teacher. And I think this is a very essential part of it, that many teachers, professors also need to integrate this sensibility of what it means to use those tools, to be aware, such as Suzanne said, also of fake news, of if this is integrated in the daily courses, you know, in the daily lessons, then you educate a new generation that is critically aware of what's happening and can then turn this for them around in the end.
Thank you. Špela, my question is a very particular one. You start working with plants already a while ago, and in one project you were into intercognition between humans and plants.
Yeah.
And at that time, this intercognition was very metaphysical, no? While now with engaging a machine, no, it's not so metaphysical anymore. No? However, following your project, from not so far, I wouldn't say from close, but not so far, no? Of course, you are not there yet, no? That a machine can emancipate itself from anthropocentristic approach. Neither the plant cannot emancipate itself using a machine to talk to us. Can you tell us a little bit where you are right now working on that with your group of engineers?
Right, yeah, actually that's a big topic to unpack.
Just one part, yeah.
But I'll try to be to the point. So I guess when I started with the opus Confronting Vegetal Otherness, I was really driven to try to sort of understand, on one hand, how we can approach plants that are entities that are ultimately foreign. I was relying heavily, whether overtly or not, on my scientific background, which sort of told me to keep it very material. So the intercognition is not, well, you call it metaphysical, maybe as a concept, but it's a process that actually takes shape in this very physical realm on all these different levels, from molecules onwards, right, or from light onwards. And then, of course, the semantic structures grow more and more complex to the point where you can also consider these relations in a deep time in ecosystems. And it all has to do somehow still with this recognition of others. In this case, if we focus on people and plants or whatever that actually might be. So I guess from being with plants for this really long time, I've gotten some insight that is really hard to express through words, because plants ultimately are different enough that they don't quite fit into our cosmology, really. But that does not necessarily preclude them from being intimate guides to our worldviews. So now when we're working on something more concrete, let's say human-made, following a certain type of analytical, mathematical logic that is embodied in these machines and in these algorithms, I'm bringing plants along in order to ensure that there's a continuous slippage of this goal, of a clear aim of where we should be heading. Because when it comes to plants, they're absolutely ungraspable in their core, or, you could call it essence, but they have no essence in this sense, in a philosophical one. So we started working on this wider project 2-3 years ago with a group of people and plants. So the people are programmers and engineers and philosophers, and biologists come to help, myself. And then there's all these different plants, and I call us a posse, because I believe that within this group, attempting to explore something like plant pleasure, or how a prosthesis of our human embodiment in terms of the AI machine could help us to sort of come closer to this undefinable, ungraspable plant being. Within a realization that we live in a sort of a flattened ontology, so kind of like I'm not so much concerned with a clear hierarchy, nor am I so concerned with the relations of power, or you could even call it violence, that are enacted within this process, because I take that as part of our realities. However, we are closely working together, learning from each other, and sort of tackling these obstacles and gaining insights that only come through already engaging in something that we know is going to be messy, that has a high probability of failing, has a high probability of us or me realizing that, again, we are just sort of repeating what I really wanted to avoid in the first place, which is a sort of utilization of plants, sort of a formalization of these relationships, etc. But I find it highly productive and super interesting, because the posse is, while we are working on something, creating glimpses into the differences, like these small moments of astonishment when one of my friends, programmers, kind of randomly said, well, I would be much more shocked if a computer made a mistake in my medical diagnosis than a human, because people are fallible in that sense. So how do you start to unpack that, and where does that actually come from? And of course, we had to talk about it, but it's really interesting. So these small glimpses into how actually the system, because they're programmers and therefore, very close to the code and to these processes of logics implemented in algorithms, how they actually come about. So these collaborations, although difficult, require patience, require a generosity on all sides, are super important to me as like insight. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Now, before I'm asking if there are some questions among our audience. I would like to ask all of you if anybody wants to answer, or all of you can. I have a general dilemma regarding the AI and how to understand it. On one side, we are now observing this AI race of the big platforms who are competing, whose AI is more powerful, who has bigger data set, and so on and so on. And from that, we can already see the position of power speaking, you know, like who would have it will rule the world, since the world is becoming more and more digitalized. You know? We can also hear in Europe, we don't have our own AI platform, so we are lagging behind. Let's do one, put your shit together and do something. You know? On the other side, also what we were talking now, there is a lot of small initiatives, even private initiatives, artistic initiatives that are building their own data sets and their own machines, their own cognition platforms. And all this boiling, you know, is somehow telling me that AI is more than just a kid of this time, you know, that it's here to stay. And should we understand it more as a technology, more as a tool, more kind of I would say mechatronics, or you know, all these fields, or can we understand it more like we started to think about internet as a common good, as a resource that belongs to everybody, you know, like water, air. Should we, I don't know, demand a treaty that will enable us to be part of one big hive mind, that it's like, I don't know, a treaty that was like for a space, and then both poles, deep sea, that belongs to everybody. So I would like if somebody has a thought about it, if somebody can say something on it. Right. Suzanne?
Well, I would vote for the second option. Of course I would. I would definitely hope that this technology becomes something that is distributed and reaches to the edges and can be bottom up and non-hierarchical in many different ways. The question of the big corporates is complicated. I mean, I agree that they can feel threatening, but they also do good for the world. I mean, you know, if we all enjoy those technologies that they distribute, the problem is, how do we engage in a way which, you know, is enhancing, and how can we increase the good side and walk away from the bad side? It is a question of power, and there's a gravitation of power. And I think what everybody here hopes is that we can do our bit to pull power away from the center. I mean, that's what I'm here for, is to pull power away from the center. I mean, I think AI actually inherently allows us to do that, and it gets kind of overcoded and kind of colonized, if you like. But in itself, it's an incredible learning tool. It enables us to have a kind of global brain or a sensing layer that gives us massive, detailed insight into the workings of the world. What we do with that data is, you know, the next question. But it can be used for conservation, it can be used for disaster relief, it can be used for helping people with mental health issues, it can be used for feeding the world by improving farming techniques. There's a whole ton of positive examples of use of AI. And I just hope that we're on one path in terms of our evolution, where there's been an initial kind of grab, but over time, we become more sophisticated as a society and there's a trickle down. But it means governments have to engage, and that's another issue. I mean, I wish the UK government engaged more. You know, that's a big, big, important topic. How can our governments be ahead of the curve or just on the curve? At the moment, it feels like something that the corporates are running far ahead with. So there's a lots of different issues going on, and it's hard to think about things in one light. I mean, even, of course, as you mentioned, AI itself, so many different dimensions to it. But for me, yeah, the big goal has to be distribution. Of course it does. And seeing the unbelievable positive potential here and bringing a ton of imagination to the future. And so for me, it's about education and helping people understand their place and how they can take a place. But it's also about bringing tons of creativity and imagination to the use and the development and to the possibilities of these technologies. So I'm quite hopeful, but I understand when people aren't, and there is work ahead to be done.
It's definitely a political question. Stephanie, you unmuted yourself. Probably you wanted to say something.
I did. I was just, I'm again going to agree with Suzanne, right? I think that there is this, and I hate this word or this terminology around it, public good, but this is something that has potential to impact us really well depending on what we do with it. Like, I seem to come back to the human element every time. It's not the technology, but what humans and how we deploy it at each level, right? So at the governmental, at the company level. And yeah, this idea that, you know, the development that's gone on this far has come out of really big companies, but they've also made paths for people to start to touch and play with these things. The question is, make sure that those things stay open and make them even more open and cognizant, much more than the circles that, you know, the people who are codifying really in a big way inhabit. That seems to be the question for me. And I really do come back to this idea of, well, yes, this is a technology that's super amazing. You know, I'm sitting here thinking about the idea of defund and get rid of technologies. And I think, and so even thinking about surveillance in different towns or whatever, like towns saying, well, we won't surveil. And while the town says they won't surveil, I don't see that a neighborhood with their rings are not surveilling. And so figuring out how to understand and use it in ways that better serve us than shut it down. Because once we start to shut it down, we think it's taken care of. But then I feel like there's so much going on behind and aside and around the scene that it's a great responsibility. It's such a great responsibility. But it's like, I'm an optimist too. So like, I think there's so much potential here. On many levels, really does come back to how humans engage and what it means to educate ourselves about this and what even education looks like, because I keep questioning at the bottom of all this, education, and the way that we bring people to it, if it does even remain the realm of people. For example, with the math, which weeds out tons of people right away, versus starting with curiosity and ways to play and then bringing people into the math. Right? And I think that's still based on things that currently exist, which greater thinking through of how do we educate people to really to engage these things. Like the Finnish thing is really interesting, right? It offers a stream of sameness, but at the same time, there's a criticality. And it's like, how do you balance those two? We want to know, keep the criticality, keep the creativity. And Špela, I will turn it over to you because I'm super circling.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add something that we shouldn't forget, because I sort of recognize these same type of questions as they appear also in the world of biotech and patenting genes, and what do we do with all this genetic information? And I think as long as there's money to be made of this information, it will never really be available, because it's not just the programs that run stuff, but it's really how do they learn? You talked about small data, but actually it's the big data that seems to be also super influential in terms of the governances, and also in terms of revealing what actually goes on. My partner, Miha Turšić, and I are working on a project, Becoming Ecological, and we're trying to sort of track the carbon flow through the globe. And we've come up against closed doors in terms of course, you can get specific data of precisely where the oil rigs are, where the pathways of the tankers go, but you just need a couple €100,000 to have access to this data, right? So I think that we should not lose, we should keep sight of the immense amount of capital interest that is behind these projects and corporations, and why the situation is actually as it is. And think about a data commons, and how do we start demanding that, and how do we start creating that, and also our relation of privacy, or our attitude of towards data privacy in relation to those platforms, because I think we will have to somehow learn to view this differently than we do now in terms of the privacy debates. Mm-hmm.
Maybe Christl, you have something to add on top.
Well, what I wanted to add, especially thinking about what approach do we have towards AI in general, and just summing up of what I've seen in the past days, it is actually not a dystopian one, coming from that media artist cultural community that at least was part of the festival. It was actually a critical, an incredible critical one, but a rather positive one, that if we work together and if we, stick together as a community, if all of those experiences coming from the artistic, from the scientific side that engage in this critical way, that we find our different ways of addressing those topics and actually finding ways of working with them in the end, starting with education, but also starting with confronting people, whether they want or not, that this is an essential part of our world nowadays. It's not something that you simply can avoid, because we are all participating in some sort of sense in collecting data, in giving away our data, and thereby we are part of this whole system, and we cannot exclude ourselves. And I think, at least for me, the important thing is just really this making aware, just this talking about. And here I really value the artistic projects that, that are around here, that come to our table, speaking about Stephanie, speaking about Špelas and all the others, that raise they don't just point their fingers, but they actually raise the questions, and they also give interesting answers, not solutions, but interesting ways of talking about those topics, of addressing them in different approaches than if we just, are within our four walls and trying to circle around the topics. And that, I think, is the visionary quality of media artists, of artists out there, that in their different way of approaching those topics, and if we combine those different ideas, we have a really bright future ahead of us. Hopefully.
Well, it sounds like a proper conclusion of our panel. We are 5 minutes past what we're supposed to have as our slot. I don't want to be aggressive and just close the curtain. Does anybody has anything to say, or maybe ask a colleague, because we were just running through the questions, or we let people go to sleep?
Or wake up on the other side of the world.
Okay, then. I wouldn't stretch anymore. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your great contributions and great discussion. I made a lot of footnotes, and see you next time.
Thanks for organizing this, Jurij.
In Linz. Yeah. Bye. Good night.
Hey, it was fantastic being with you.